She was scrubbing a stranger's kitchen floor at 11 at night, in a house she had lived in for 3 years, married to a man who was sleeping upstairs, and had no idea what his own mother had turned his wife into. Sarah would tell people later that the strangest part was not the exhaustion, and not the humiliation of being on her knees at that hour, while the rest of the family slept peacefully above her. The strangest part was how normal it had started to feel. She had stopped asking herself when this became her life, because some part of her already knew the answer, and she was not ready to face what that answer meant about the man she had married and the woman who had raised him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Sarah Bennett, a woman who believed she was marrying into a family, and Jason Whitmore, the man she loved, who spent years failing to see what his own household had become. It is the story of Diane Whitmore, a mother who convinced herself that control was the same thing as care, and who built something around her son's marriage so quietly that neither he nor his wife noticed the walls going up until they were already standing inside them. And it is the story of one ordinary afternoon when Jason came home 3 hours earlier than expected and saw, for the first time, exactly what his wife's life had become behind the closed doors of the house he thought was full of love. How does a woman who once felt chosen end up feeling like hired help in her own home? That is the question sitting underneath everything that follows, and it is not a question with an easy answer, because nothing about what happened to Sarah involved a single dramatic moment where she could point and say, there, that is where it went wrong. It happened in small increments, the way most quiet tragedies do, one reasonable request at a time, until reasonable requests became expectations, and expectations became her entire identity inside that family. What you are about to hear is not a story about a monster. It is a story about how ordinary people, driven by fear and old wounds, can build a prison out of good intentions, and how long it can take the people living inside it to realize the door was never actually locked. Sarah met Jason Whitmore during her second year working as a claims coordinator at a mid-sized insurance office outside Charlotte, North Carolina. He came in to help his father settle a property dispute, and she remembered thinking he had the kind of patience that seemed rare in men his age, the way he listened fully before responding, the way he thanked the receptionist by name on his way out. They started talking over coffee that turned into dinner that turned into 18 months of a relationship built on long drives and inside jokes, and the quiet certainty that they had found something worth keeping. Jason proposed on a hiking trail overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, and Sarah said yes before he had even finished the sentence, because for the first time since losing her own mother at 22, she felt like she was being welcomed into something whole. The Whitmore family, from the outside, looked like exactly what Sarah had been missing her entire adult life. Robert Whitmore, Jason's father, had built a modest but respected construction business over 3 decades, and Diane, his wife, had spent those same 3 decades running the household with a precision that people in town described as admirable. Family dinners were frequent and loud and full of laughter. Diane hugged Sarah tightly at their engagement party and told her, in front of everyone, that she had always wanted a daughter, and that Sarah felt like family already. Sarah cried that night, grateful, believing she had found not just a husband, but a mother figure to fill a hole that had been empty for years. She had no way of knowing that gratitude would later be used against her. The trouble began so gently that Sarah barely registered it as trouble at all. Diane suggested, shortly after the wedding, that Sarah and Jason move into the guest house on the family property instead of renting an apartment across town, just until they had saved enough for a down payment of their own. It made financial sense. Robert's health had started to decline, his knees failing him after years of physical labor, and Diane framed the arrangement as mutually beneficial, a way for the young couple to save money while also being close enough to help out when needed. Jason agreed immediately, grateful for the practicality of it, and Sarah, wanting to be the kind of wife who supported her husband's family, agreed as well. Neither of them noticed that the terms of that arrangement were never actually written down, or discussed again, or questioned. What began as occasional help slowly hardened into routine. Diane would call the guest house at 7 in the morning asking Sarah to run to the pharmacy for Robert's medication before work. She would mention, almost in passing, that the family dinner she was hosting that weekend for 12 people felt like too much for her aging hands, and would Sarah mind coming over a few hours early to help prep? Sarah always said yes, because saying no felt petty, felt ungrateful, felt like rejecting the very family she had been so relieved to be welcomed into. She told herself this was simply what family meant, that reciprocity was the currency of belonging, and that if she gave enough, she would eventually be given the same ease and rest that everyone else in that house seemed to enjoy without asking. By the second year of the marriage, the pattern had a shape Sarah could have drawn with her eyes closed. She left her own job early on Fridays to prepare Sunday dinners that took the entire weekend to plan and execute. She managed Robert's growing list of medical appointments, driving him herself when Diane claimed to be too overwhelmed to handle it. She cleaned not just the guest house, but increasingly the main house as well, first with an unspoken understanding, and eventually with an explicit weekly schedule that Diane had written out and taped inside the pantry door, Sarah's name at the top of every single task. Jason worked long hours at a logistics company 40 minutes away, coming home tired and grateful for a home that always somehow ran smoothly, never once asking his wife how that smoothness came to exist. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who love you and still feeling invisible, and that was the loneliness Sarah began carrying without fully numbing it. She started noticing that her own calls to her college roommate went unreturned longer than they used to, not because her friend had pulled away, but because Sarah herself had less time and less energy to reach out, her days consumed entirely by tasks that belonged to someone else's household. Diane, meanwhile, had developed a habit of gently steering conversations away whenever Sarah mentioned visiting her aunt in Savannah or attending a former coworker's baby shower, framing the family's needs as more urgent, more immediate, more deserving of Sarah's limited time. Sarah began to feel her own life shrinking, quietly, one small sacrifice at a time. What made it harder to name was the fact that Diane was never outright unkind. She complimented Sarah's cooking in front of guests. She bought her small gifts on her birthday, thoughtful ones, scarves in Sarah's favorite color, a book by an author Sarah had once mentioned liking. It was this mixture of genuine warmth and quiet control that made Sarah doubt her own growing discomfort. Because how could a woman who remembered her favorite author also be the same woman who expected her to iron Robert's shirts every Tuesday without being asked? Sarah began to wonder if she was simply ungrateful, if other daughters-in-law would have been thrilled with this level of closeness, and that self-doubt became its own kind of weight, heavier in some ways than the chores themselves, because it convinced her to keep her growing unease entirely to herself. Jason, for his part, remained almost entirely unaware of the shape his wife's days had taken. He had grown up watching his mother run the household with an iron efficiency that he associated with love, the way she had always managed everything so that his father never had to worry, so that family gatherings always felt effortless despite the enormous effort actually being spent behind the scenes. When Robert's health began declining, Jason quietly absorbed the belief that his mother needed protecting, that questioning her methods or her requests would be a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed raising him. He saw Sarah's involvement in his parents' care as evidence that his wife had been fully embraced by his family, a sign of unity rather than a sign of erosion, and he thanked Sarah for her patience in passing, never once asking what that patience was actually costing her. There were small warning signs along the way, moments that Sarah would later replay and recognize as the fault lines she had been too tired or too hopeful to examine closely at the time. There was the afternoon Diane rewrote the grocery list Sarah had already completed, insisting certain brands were unacceptable, and Sarah drove back to the store without a word of protest. There was the evening Sarah mentioned wanting to look for a position closer to her original career path, something with more growth, and Diane gently reminded her how much the family depended on her flexibility right now, how selfish timing could hurt everyone, especially Robert. There was the birthday dinner Sarah planned for her own father, quietly canceled when Diane scheduled a family obligation on the same evening without asking, an obligation that turned out, weeks later, to have never actually been necessary at all. By the third year, Sarah had developed a private language of endurance that she shared with no one, not even Jason. She would remind herself, on the hardest days, that this was temporary, that once they saved enough to move into their own home, the dynamic would shift, that distance would restore the boundaries that closeness had slowly dissolved. She held onto small acts of resistance that felt significant only to her, keeping a locked folder on her phone with job listings in other cities, calling her aunt in Savannah from her car during lunch breaks so Diane would never overhear, setting aside a small amount of money each month into an account Diane did not know existed. She did not yet understand these instincts as preparation for something larger. She understood them only as the last threads of a self she was afraid of losing entirely. The moment that changed everything began, as these moments often do, with something entirely mundane. Jason's company had scheduled a mandatory software transition that Friday, one that was expected to keep the entire logistics team working late into the evening, and Jason had told Sarah the night before not to expect him until close to 9. Diane, upon hearing this, had immediately seized the opportunity to schedule an important dinner for that same evening, one meant to impress two of Robert's oldest business associates who were considering a final partnership deal before his retirement. Sarah had been given the assignment 3 days earlier, an elaborate 7-course meal for 12 guests, full table settings, a menu Diane had handwritten herself, and taped to the refrigerator with instructions that left no room for improvisation or rest. What no one accounted for was the fever Sarah had been fighting since Wednesday, a stomach virus she had caught from a coworker, one that left her weak and dehydrated but unwilling to admit it, because admitting it meant asking Diane to postpone or reduce the dinner, and some exhausted part of her no longer believed that request would be honored. She spent Thursday night vomiting quietly in the guest house bathroom so Jason would not hear it through the thin walls, telling him in the morning that she simply had not slept well. By Friday afternoon, she was pale and trembling, forcing down crackers between preparing a cream sauce and deboning a chicken, moving through Diane's kitchen on legs that barely held her, because the dinner started at 6 and there was, in Diane's words, simply no room for anyone to fall behind today of all days. Diane noticed Sarah's condition and said nothing kind about it. She noticed the sweat on Sarah's forehead, the way her hands shook slightly as she plated the appetizers, and instead of offering help, she reminded Sarah, in a tone that had long since stopped sounding gentle to Sarah's ears, that Robert's entire business future depended on tonight going smoothly, and that everyone had to push through discomfort sometimes for the good of the family. Sarah nodded, because nodding had become automatic, and continued working, refilling water glasses and checking the oven timer and smiling at guests who complimented the food she had spent 2 days preparing while barely able to keep water down herself. By 5:50, she was standing at the kitchen counter, one hand gripping the edge of it, the room tilting slightly at the corners of her vision. It was at exactly that moment, 5 minutes before the guests were expected to arrive, that Sarah's body finally gave out from beneath her, and she slid down against the lower cabinets, her legs unable to hold her weight any longer, her forehead damp and her breathing shallow. Diane, standing only a few feet away arranging place cards, turned and looked down at her daughter-in-law on the floor of the kitchen, and instead of kneeling beside her, instead of calling for help, she said, in a voice tight with irritation rather than concern, that Sarah needed to get up immediately, that the guests would be arriving any minute, and that this was absolutely not the time to fall apart. She began listing, almost mechanically, everything that still remained unfinished, the bread that needed to come out, the wine that needed decanting, as though Sarah's collapse were simply one more inconvenient item on the evening's schedule. And it was into this exact scene that Jason walked, 3 hours earlier than anyone expected, because the software transition at his office had been postponed at the last minute, and his manager had sent the entire team home. He came through the back door of his parents' house, intending to surprise Sarah, a small bouquet of grocery store flowers in his hand, something he had picked up on impulse because he had a rare free evening and wanted, for once, to do something thoughtful for his wife without being asked. What he found instead was his wife curled on the kitchen floor, pale and shaking, and his mother standing over her reciting a list of unfinished tasks, as though the woman on the ground were an employee who had simply chosen an inconvenient moment to underperform. Jason did not move for what felt to him like an entire minute, though it was likely only a few seconds, his mind struggling to reconcile the scene in front of him with the version of his household he had carried in his head for 3 years. He dropped the flowers on the counter without noticing he had done it and crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides, kneeling beside Sarah and lifting her head gently, asking her name, asking how long she had been like this, his voice cracking in a way Sarah had never heard before. Diane, startled by his sudden appearance, immediately shifted her tone, insisting Sarah had simply gotten overheated from the stove, that she was fine, that dinner needed to be salvaged before the guests arrived in minutes. Jason, still kneeling, looked up at his mother with an expression Sarah would later describe as the first time she had ever seen him truly see the house they were living in. What Jason had walked into was not, as it turned out, an isolated incident but the visible tip of something that had been accumulating in plain sight for years, and the questions now crowding his mind extended far beyond this one evening. Why had his wife been cooking a 7-course meal while visibly ill? Why had his mother, upon finding her collapsed, responded with irritation rather than alarm? And more disturbing than either of those, why had he himself never once asked, in 3 years of marriage, exactly how his wife's days were actually spent while he was at work, content instead to simply enjoy the results without questioning the labor behind them? He canceled the dinner himself, informing the arriving guests through gritted politeness that there had been a family emergency, and carried Sarah, still weak, back to the guest house, where he sat beside her bed long into the night, asking questions he had waited 3 years too long to ask. The days that followed the collapse were unlike anything the Whitmore family had experienced before, because for the first time, Jason began paying attention. He watched his mother's morning phone calls to the guest house with new suspicion. He noticed the schedule taped inside the pantry door, Sarah's name at the top of every line, and felt something cold settle in his stomach as he read through a week's worth of expectations he had never known existed. He asked Sarah, gently and repeatedly, to tell him everything, and Sarah, exhausted in every sense a person can be exhausted, finally let 3 years of carefully managed silence spill out of her, describing not one dramatic betrayal but hundreds of small ones, each reasonable on its own, devastating in accumulation. Jason listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with every new detail, and when she finished, he told her he was sorry in a voice that sounded like it belonged to a much older man. Diane's response to Jason's sudden scrutiny was not remorse but recalibration. She insisted, when Jason confronted her directly, that she had never asked Sarah to do anything beyond what any loving family member would offer freely, that Sarah had never once complained, that if there had been a problem, surely Sarah would have said something instead of quietly resenting a family that had only ever tried to include her. This reframing, Sarah realized when Jason relayed it to her, was not new. It was the same technique Diane had used for years, transforming every boundary Sarah might have tried to set into evidence of Sarah's own ingratitude, making silence feel safer than honesty, making honesty feel like betrayal. Jason, to his credit, did not accept his mother's framing this time, but the fact that he needed to hear it stated so plainly, after 3 years of living inside the pattern, told Sarah something painful about how deeply normalized her own erasure had become. It was Jason's younger sister, Lauren, who eventually admitted the truth that reframed everything Sarah thought she understood about her own situation. Over coffee one afternoon, weeks after the collapse, Lauren confessed that she had watched this exact pattern unfold once before, years earlier, with their uncle's first wife, a woman named Patricia who had married into the family with the same warmth and hope Sarah once carried, and who had slowly been folded into the same unpaid, unacknowledged labor before eventually divorcing their uncle and disappearing from family gatherings entirely, never spoken of again except in hushed, disapproving tones that always somehow made her the villain of the story. Lauren admitted she had recognized the signs early in Sarah's marriage and said nothing, telling herself it was not her place to interfere, a silence she now deeply regretted, understanding too late that her silence had made her complicit in whatever Sarah endured. This revelation opened something Sarah had not expected, a question she had never thought to ask, which was whether her own experience had been an accident of one difficult mother-in-law or something closer to a pattern deliberately repeated. Sarah began, quietly and without telling Jason at first, to look through old family boxes stored in the guest house attic, boxes Diane had asked her to organize months earlier as part of a larger household project. Buried near the bottom of one box, beneath old photographs and Robert's early business ledgers, Sarah found a manila folder containing several sets of household agreements, informal but detailed documents outlining division of labor, dated years before her own marriage, bearing Patricia's signature alongside Diane's, describing an arrangement disturbingly similar to the one Sarah had lived inside without ever having agreed to anything in writing at all. What Sarah found beneath that folder, however, was the detail that reframed everything that had happened to her, the detail that turned 3 years of quiet exhaustion into something closer to calculated design. Tucked inside a sealed envelope near the bottom of the same box was a household services agreement bearing her own signature, dated from the week of her wedding, a document she had no memory of ever reading closely. Buried among the stack of family welcome paperwork Diane had asked her to sign the week she moved into the guest house. Paperwork Sarah had assumed at the time was simply insurance forms and property disclosures related to living on the family land. The agreement described, in careful legal language, an arrangement in which Sarah would provide household and caregiving services to the Whitmore family in exchange for reduced housing costs. A document that, buried in fine print, specified that any future division of shared property in the event of divorce would exclude compensation for these services, framing 3 years of Sarah's labor as something she had contractually agreed to provide for free. Sarah sat with that folder for nearly an hour before she could bring herself to call Jason, her hands cold, her mind circling back through 3 years of exhaustion she had explained away as simply the nature of family, now recontextualized as the execution of a plan someone had put in writing before she had even unpacked her wedding gifts. When Jason arrived and read the documents himself, his face went through several stages Sarah would remember for the rest of her life, disbelief giving way to a kind of grief she had never seen in him before, not for himself, but for what his mother had apparently done to 2 different women who had trusted her, years apart, believing they were being welcomed into a family rather than recruited into an arrangement designed to protect the Whitmore estate at their expense. He asked Sarah, quietly, if she could ever forgive him for not seeing it sooner, and Sarah, for the first time in years, did not have an automatic answer ready. The confrontation between Jason and his mother, when it finally happened, was unlike any conversation the family had ever had. Jason laid the documents on the kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had once served meals to guests while barely able to stand, and asked his mother directly whether she had drafted the same agreement for Patricia decades earlier. Diane's initial denial lasted only a few minutes before crumbling under the specificity of what Jason already knew. And what followed was not an apology, but a justification. Diane insisting that she had only ever tried to protect the family's assets, that she had watched her own mother lose everything in a divorce decades earlier, and had promised herself she would never let that happen to her own children, that the agreements were not cruelty but foresight. A shield built out of old fear rather than malice. Jason listened, and for the first time in his life, recognized his mother not as untouchable, but as someone who had let her own wounds calcify into something that had hurt the people she claimed to love most. Robert, when he learned the full extent of what his wife had orchestrated, reacted with a quiet devastation that surprised everyone, including Diane. He had spent decades trusting his wife's management of the household without question, the same way Jason had trusted her without question, and confronting the reality that his own comfort had been built partly on the unpaid labor of 2 women who had never truly consented to the arrangement left him unable to look at Diane the same way for weeks. He did not defend her, and he did not attack her either, choosing instead a long, uncomfortable silence that Diane found harder to bear than any argument might have been. Because for the first time in their 40-year marriage, her husband's unquestioning support was no longer guaranteed. Sarah and Jason moved out of the guest house within the month, into a modest rental across town that Jason insisted on funding entirely himself, refusing to accept a cent from his parents even as a temporary bridge. The move was not triumphant so much as necessary, a physical distance that both of them recognized as the only way to rebuild whatever trust remained between them, not just as husband and wife, but between Jason and the family he had spent his whole life believing was simply loving rather than controlling. Sarah found the transition harder than she expected, not because she missed the house, but because leaving it forced her to sit with 3 years of grief she had postponed, while simply trying to survive each day. Grief for the version of family she thought she had found, and grief for the version of herself that had disappeared slowly enough that she almost hadn't noticed. The rebuilding of Sarah and Jason's marriage in the months that followed was slow and imperfect, built not on grand gestures, but on smaller, steadier ones. Jason asking Sarah's opinion before making plans that involved his parents. Jason attending therapy alongside her to understand his own complicity in a dynamic he had allowed to exist through inattention rather than intention. Jason learning, gradually, to notice the things he had never noticed before. Sarah, for her part, had to relearn how to ask for things directly, how to trust that a request would not be met with resentment or reframed as ingratitude, a skill she realized she had lost somewhere in those 3 years without ever registering the loss. There were setbacks. There were nights Sarah woke from dreams where she was back on that kitchen floor, unheard, and Jason would sit with her until the fear passed, understanding now what he had failed to understand before. Diane never fully apologized, not in the way Sarah once hoped she might. Back when she still believed the woman who hugged her so tightly at her engagement party genuinely loved her. What Diane offered instead, months later, over a stilted lunch Sarah agreed to more for Jason's sake than her own, was a version of acknowledgement wrapped so tightly in self-justification that it barely qualified as remorse at all, an admission that perhaps she had asked for more than was fair, delivered alongside a reminder of everything she herself had sacrificed over the years, as though the two things canceled each other out. Sarah listened and recognized with a clarity that felt almost peaceful that she no longer needed Diane's approval the way she once had, that she could sit across from this woman without flinching, without shrinking, and simply see her now for exactly what she was, a person shaped by her own fear, who had passed that fear on to others without ever fully reckoning with where it came from. Lauren, in the months following the confrontation, made her own quiet attempts at repair, reaching out to Sarah more often, eventually admitting that she had also found a copy of her own household agreement, one Diane had drafted for her years earlier before Lauren's marriage had ended for entirely unrelated reasons, an agreement Lauren had signed without reading closely, just as Sarah had. The two women, who had never been particularly close before, found something unexpected in this shared history, a kind of solidarity built not on friendship exactly, but on mutual recognition of what it costs to be pulled into someone else's fear and mistaken for consent. Lauren became, in the months that followed, one of the people Sarah trusted most inside a family she otherwise approached now with careful, deliberate distance. What Sarah eventually came to understand, sitting with everything that had happened, was that the story was never really about a cruel mother-in-law demanding unpaid labor, though that had certainly been true. It was about how easily love and obligation can be made to look identical, how a family can build walls so gradually that the people inside them mistake captivity for closeness, and how long it can take even a good man, a genuinely loving husband, to notice what has been happening in his own home simply because he had never been taught to look. Sarah did not walk away from that chapter of her life bitter so much as changed, more careful now about what generosity she offers freely and what boundaries she insists on stating clearly, understanding that kindness without boundaries is not virtue. It is vulnerability waiting for someone to take advantage of it. Jason, for his part, carries a different kind of weight now, the quiet grief of realizing that his own comfort for 3 years had been built on his wife's exhaustion, and that his failure was not one of malice but of inattention, which in its own way had cost just as much. He speaks now, when the subject comes up among friends, about the importance of actually asking the people you love how they are doing, not the polite version of the question, but the real one, the kind that requires you to sit with an uncomfortable answer if that is what comes. He and Sarah are still married, still rebuilding, still learning what an equal partnership actually requires after 3 years of one built on something else entirely. And neither of them believes the process is finished, only that it is finally, for the first time, honest. Maybe the real lesson in Sarah and Jason's story is not that families are dangerous or that love cannot be trusted, but that the people who love us can still, without ever meaning to, become the architects of our own disappearance if we let fear stand in for honesty for long enough. Maybe the cost was never really the chores, or the schedule taped inside a pantry door, or even the document buried in an old folder. Maybe the real cost was the 3 years Sarah spent believing that shrinking herself was the price of belonging, and the years it will take her to fully believe otherwise. Would you have recognized the pattern sooner than Sarah did? Or do you think it is only human to mistake exhaustion for love when the people asking it of you are the ones you want, more than anything, to belong to? Have you ever found yourself giving so much to a family, a partner, or a friend that you slowly lost sight of where you ended and their expectations began? Have you ever discovered, the way Sarah did, that something you believed was simply the nature of love was actually something someone else had quietly designed? We would love to hear your own story in the comments below, whatever shape it takes, because these are not just stories about other people's pain. They are stories about what it means to be human, about how easily good intentions can curdle into control, and how much courage it takes to finally see clearly the house you have been living in all along. If Sarah and Jason's story stayed with you tonight, you are not alone, and these are exactly the kinds of stories we believe deserve to be told with care and heard with an open heart. If you found yourself moved by what you just watched, we would be so grateful if you subscribed to Scars and Stories, where every week we explore the quiet moments that break families apart and the harder, more honest moments that sometimes bring them back together. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today, for sitting with Sarah and Jason's story from beginning to end, and for being the kind of audience that understands these stories matter. We hope to see you again very soon on our next post.